The wind howled like a pack of wolves across the frost-crusted hills of Dark Age Britain. In a small settlement nestled in a river valley, the Britons of Caer went prepared for the long winter. The sun, a weak orb barely cresting the horizon, offered little warmth. Snow blanketed the roundhouses, their thatched roofs sagging under the weight, and the air bit at exposed skin like a blade. For Bran, a wiry man with calloused hands and a weathered face, winter was not just a season. It was a battle. Bran's people, descendants of Romano-Britons and Celtic tribes, had learned to survive through centuries of hardship. As autumn's last leaves fell, the village had worked feverishly. The harvest was stored in pits lined with clay to keep grain dry and safe from vermin. Apples, roots, and dried berries were packed into woven baskets, while smoked fish and salted meat hung in the rafters of the communal hall. The Britons knew that food was their shield against the cold's relentless siege. Their homes, built low to the ground with thick wattle and daub walls, were designed to trap heat. Bran's family huddled inside their roundhouse, where a central hearth burned day and night. The fire was their lifeline, fed by logs gathered from the nearby forest and dried in summer stacks. Peat, cut from bogs, supplemented the wood when supplies ran low, its smoky tang filling the air. The Britons layered their clothing, wool tunics, cloaks, and furs stitched from deer and wolf hides, to ward off the chill that seeped through cracks. Women like Bran's wife, Elwyn, wove blankets from sheep's wool, dyed with woad and madder, to keep the children warm as they slept on straw pallets. Food was rationed carefully. Elwyn boiled barley and beans into a thick pottage, flavored with wild garlic and herbs foraged in warmer months. Meat was a luxury, saved for feasts or when hunger gnawed too fiercely. The Britons supplemented their diet with what the land offered: hazelnuts, crab apples, and, in desperate times, boiled bark or nettles. Starvation was a real threat, especially in late winter when stores dwindled, and the village kept a keen eye on their supplies, sharing communal meals to stretch resources. Community was their strength. No one survived alone. When blizzards trapped families in their homes, neighbors cleared paths through the snow to check on the elderly or sick. The village headman, Cynric, organized work parties to repair roofs crushed by ice or to hunt for winter game, hares or the occasional deer. Storytelling kept spirits high. On long nights, the elders recounted tales of heroes like Ambrosius, who fought off Saxon invaders, their voices rising over the crackle of the fire. These gatherings fostered unity, reminding the Britons that they were bound by more than blood. They were bound by survival. The Britons also leaned on their knowledge of the land. They built their settlements near rivers or springs, ensuring water even when streams froze. They observed the stars and the behavior of animals to predict weather shifts, knowing a sudden thaw could flood their homes or a prolonged freeze could lock away their resources. Some still whispered prayers to old gods, Luff or Cernunnos, while others, newly Christian, lit candles for saints, blending old and new beliefs to seek protection from the cold. Winter tested their endurance, but it also honed their resilience. When a fever swept through Caer Gwent one February, Elwyn brewed remedies from dried yarrow and elderberry, passed down from her grandmother. When a wolf pack grew bold, Bran and the hunters drove them off with spears and fire, their shouts echoing through the frost-laden trees. Every challenge was met with grit and ingenuity, for the Britons knew that spring, though distant, would come. By March, the first green shoots pierced the snow, and the village stirred with cautious hope. Bran stood outside his roundhouse, his breath no longer clouding in the air, and watched the sun climb higher. The winter had been brutal, claiming a few of the old and weak, but Caer Gwent endured. They always did. The long winter of Caer Gwent. The frost had come early to Caer Gwent, creeping over the hills like a thief in the night. By Samhain, the festival marking winter's edge, the ground was hard as iron, and the River Wye, which snaked past the village, carried shards of ice in its sluggish current. Bran stood at the edge of the settlement, his breath clouding in the dawn's gray light, and scanned the horizon. The sky was heavy, promising snow. He tightened his wool cloak, its edges frayed from years of use, and muttered a prayer to the old gods his father once honored. Winter was no mere season, it was a beast, and it was awake. Inside their roundhouse, Elwyn knelt by the hearth, coaxing a weak flame from damp logs. The fire sputtered, casting flickering shadows on the wattle and daub walls. Their children, Leo and Gwyn, huddled under a pile of furs, their small faces pale but alert. "Keep the fire alive," Elwyn said softly, her voice steady despite the worry in her eyes. She stirred a pot of barley pottage, its steam mingling with the smoky air. The grain stores were lower than last year, and the thought gnawed at her like a rat in the dark. The Britons of Caer Gwent, a mix of Romano-British families and Celtic kin, had faced winters before, but this one felt different. The elders whispered of a colder age, a time when the sun grew shy and the earth turned hard for months. The late antique Little Ice Age, as modern scholars would later call it, had tightened its grip on Britain, plunging temperatures lower than living memory. The village's survival depended on preparation, and they had worked tirelessly through the warmer months. The granary pits, dug deep and lined with clay, held barley and oats, while baskets of dried apples and hazelnuts lined the communal hall. Smoked fish hung in skeins, their salty tang a reminder of summer's bounty. But Bran knew it might not be enough. The village was a cluster of a dozen roundhouses, their thatched roofs weighted with stones to defy the wind. Each home was built to trap heat, with low doorways and thick walls packed with straw for insulation. The central hearth was the heart of every family, its embers never allowed to die. Bran's brother, Owain, had spent days cutting peat from the nearby bog, stacking it to dry for when the firewood ran low. The Britons wore layers of wool, tunics, leggings, and cloaks, woven by the women and dyed with woad's deep blue or madder's rusty red. Furs from deer, badger, or wolf added warmth, though the best pelts were reserved for the children and the sick. As the first snow fell, blanketing the hills in a white shroud, the village sealed itself against the cold. The livestock, sheep and a few hardy cattle, were brought into pens near the houses, their body heat a precious resource. Bran and the other men checked the roofs daily, clearing snow before it could collapse the thatch. The women, led by Elwyn, rationed the food with care. A typical meal was a thin pottage of barley, beans, and wild herbs, sometimes thickened with a scrap of salted pork. On good days, they added forage treasures, sloes, crab apples, or roasted hazelnuts. On bad days, when the stores grew lean, Elwyn boiled nettles or birch bark, masking the bitterness with a pinch of precious salt. Community was their greatest weapon. No one faced the winter alone. When a blizzard buried the paths between houses, the men took turns digging tunnels through the snow, their hands chapped and bleeding. Cynric, the headman, was old but unyielding, his voice like gravel as he rallied the village. "We are the blood of this land," he said one night in the communal hall, his words rising over the crackle of the fire. "The Saxons may harry our borders, but winter will not break us." The villagers nodded, their faces lit by the glow, and passed around a horn of weak mead. The children listened wide-eyed as Cynric's wife, Irwin, told tales of Vortigern and the dragon beneath the hills, stories that wove hope into the long nights. But hope was tested. In December, a fever crept into Caer Gwent, silent and deadly. It struck the young and old first, leaving them shivering despite the furs. Elwyn, whose mother had taught her the old ways, brewed teas of yarrow and elderberry, crushing the dried herbs with a stone pestle. She moved from house to house, her cloak dusted with snow, tending to the sick. Bran watched her with pride and fear, knowing the fever could claim her too. The village buried 2 elders before the moon turned, their bodies laid in shallow graves beyond the hill, marked with stones to guide their spirits. The cold brought other threats. Wolves, driven by hunger, prowled closer to the settlement. One night, their howls woke the village, and Bran joined the hunters to drive them off. Armed with spears and torches, they tracked the pack through the snow, their shouts echoing in the frozen dark. A young hunter, Daffod, took a wolf's claw to the arm but lived, his wound bound with linen and honey. The victory cost them dearly. Daffod's arm festered, and the wolves grew bolder, scenting weakness. By January, the food stores were dangerously low. The granary pits, once brimming, showed bare earth at their bottoms. Bran and Cynric organized a hunting party, a desperate bid for meat. They trekked into the forest, where the trees stood like skeletons against the sky. After hours of tracking, they felled a single deer, its ribs stark beneath its hide. The meat was divided equally, a morsel for each family, and the hide was cured for a new pair of boots. The bones were boiled for broth, nothing wasted. The Britons leaned heavily on their knowledge of the land. They knew where springs bubbled even in the deepest freeze, and they chipped ice from the river's edge for water. They watched the stars, Orion's belt, bright in the winter sky, for signs of coming storms. Elwyn taught Leo and Gwyn to read the behavior of birds. A flock of crows circling low meant a blizzard was near. Some villagers still offered gifts to the old gods, a sprig of holly laid at a sacred spring, while others, swayed by the Christian monks who sometimes passed through, prayed to St. Cuthbert for deliverance. Bran, caught between worlds, did both, whispering to the river and crossing himself in the dark. February was the cruelest month. The cold deepened, and the snow piled higher than a man's waist. A roundhouse collapsed under the weight, trapping a family inside. The village rallied, digging them out with bare hands, but the youngest child, a girl of 3, did not survive the night. Grief hung heavy, but there was no time to mourn. The men rebuilt the house, reinforcing the roof with extra timber, while the women shared their blankets to keep the family warm. Yet even in the darkest days, there were moments of light. One night, as the wind screamed outside, the villagers gathered in the communal hall. Irwin sang a song of spring, her voice thin but clear, and the children clapped along, their laughter a rare warmth. Bran carved a wooden horse for Gwyn, who clutched it as he slept. Elwyn wove a new cloak for Lo, her fingers nimble despite the cold. These small acts of love were as vital as food or fire, binding the village together. By March, the first signs of spring appeared. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of green. The river flowed freely again, and a flock of geese passed overhead, a promise of warmer days. Bran stood with Elwyn outside their roundhouse, watching the sun linger a little longer in the sky. The winter had taken its toll. 3 lives lost, the stores nearly gone. But Caergwen had endured. Bran clasped Elwyn's hand, her fingers rough but warm. "We're still here," he said, his voice low. She nodded, her eyes on the horizon. "And we always will be." Historical grounding. This expanded story draws on archaeological and historical evidence to depict the survival strategies of Dark Age Britons. The late Antique Little Ice Age, c. 536 to 660 CE, brought colder winters, as evidenced by Treering data and contemporary accounts like those of Gildas, who described a bleak post-Roman Britain. Settlements like Caer Gwent, inspired by hill forts such as Dinas Powys, were built with practical designs, roundhouses with central hearths and thick walls, as excavated at sites like Tintagel. Food storage in clay-lined pits and the use of smoked or salted meat are supported by finds at Weststow and other sites. Clothing and textiles, reconstructed from fragments and descriptions in texts like the Life of St. Cuthbert, included wool and furs, with weaving a key skill. Communal living and resource sharing are inferred from village layouts and the absence of individual wealth in many burials, suggesting a collective ethos. Herbal remedies, like yarrow and elderberry, align with ethnobotanical studies of Celtic and early medieval practices. The blend of pagan and Christian beliefs reflects the transitional religious landscape, as seen in artifacts like cross-inscribed stones alongside older ritual sites. The thaw and the threat. The snows of March had begun to soften, turning the hills around Caer Gwent into a patchwork of white and green. The River Wye, once choked with ice, now ran swift and clear, its banks muddy from the melt. Bran stood at the edge of the village, his boots sinking into the slush, and watched a pair of ravens wheel against a sky that was, for the first time in months, more blue than gray. The air still carried a bite, but it no longer clawed at his lungs. Spring was coming, yet Bran's heart was heavy. Winter had left Caer Gwent battered, its people gaunt, and its stores all but empty. The thaw brought hope, but it also brought danger. Inside the roundhouse, Elwyn knelt by the hearth, scraping the last of the barley from a wooden bowl to make a thin gruel for Leo and Gwyn. The children's faces were thinner than they had been at Samhain, their eyes too large in their small skulls. Elwyn's hands trembled as she stirred the pot, not from cold but from the weight of the truth. The granary pits were bare, and the smoked fish were gone. The village had survived the deepest cold, but hunger now stalked them like a shadow. The Britons of Caer Gwent were no strangers to hardship. Their ancestors had endured the fall of Rome, the raids of Saxons, and the whims of a fickle climate. The late Antique Little Ice Age had made winters fiercer, with frost lingering into what should have been spring. Archaeological traces, like the shrunken tree rings from the period, told of a world grown colder, where crops faltered and game grew scarce. Yet the people of Caer Gwent clung to the land, their lives shaped by the rhythms of survival. Their roundhouses, huddled together like a herd against a storm, were marvels of necessity. Built low to defy the wind, their walls of wattle and daub were packed with straw and clay to hold in the heat. The thatched roofs, anchored with stones, had held firm through the worst blizzards, though one had collapsed in February, claiming young Aoife's life. The central hearths burned constantly, fed by logs and peat cut in warmer months. Owain, Bran's brother, had nearly lost a finger to frostbite while hauling peat from the bog, but he never complained. "Better a finger than a fire," he'd said, his grin crooked but fierce. Clothing was another shield against the cold. Elwyn and the other women had spent the summer spinning wool into thread, weaving it into tunics and cloaks on looms that creaked like old bones. The garments were dyed with woad's deep blue or madder's earthy red, colors that reminded them of life beyond the gray. Furs, deer, badger, even the occasional wolf, were stitched into linings or worn as capes, their warmth a bulwark against the wind that howled down from the hills. The children, Leo and Gwyn among them, wore smaller versions, their cloaks patched from scraps but no less warm. Food, though, was the true battleground. The village had prepared as best they could, storing barley and oats in clay-lined pits, drying apples and berries, and salting what meat they could spare. But the harvest had been meager, stunted by a wet summer, and the winter had been long. By March, the pottage Elwyn served was little more than water flavored with herbs and the memory of grain. The villagers foraged when they could, braving the snow to gather nettles or dig for roots, but the land was stingy. Once, in desperation, Bran had boiled strips of birch bark, its bitter broth barely enough to quiet the children's hunger. Community held them together when all else failed. Cynric, the headman, was a grizzled figure, his beard streaked with gray, but his will unbreakable. He called the village to the communal hall each week, where they shared what little they had: a scrap of meat, a handful of nuts, a sip of mead fermented from last year's honey. The hall was their sanctuary, its walls hung with woven tapestries depicting stags and rivers, faded but proud. Here, Iarwen, Cynric's wife, wove stories of heroes like Ambrosius Aurelianus, who had held the Saxons at bay, or of the old gods who slept in the hills. The tales kept the children's spirits high, even as their bellies growled. But the thaw brought new threats. The melting snow revealed the world beyond Caer Gwent, and with it came whispers of danger. Scouts reported tracks in the forest, not wolves, but men. Saxons, likely from the eastern lowlands, where their settlements grew like weeds. The Britons had clashed with them before, losing kin and cattle in raids that left scars on the land and the heart. Cynric called a council in the hall, the air thick with smoke and tension. "The Saxons smell our weakness," he said, his voice low but steady. "We must be ready." Bran, Owain, and the other men sharpened their spears, their blades forged from iron traded years ago from a traveling smith. The women, too, prepared, hiding knives beneath their cloaks and teaching the older children to wield slings. Elwyn, her face set like stone, showed Lau how to aim a stone at a target, her voice calm but firm. "If they come you, run," she told him. "But if you must fight, aim for the eyes." Lau, barely 10, nodded, his small hands steady despite the fear in his gaze. The village fortified itself as best it could. They repaired the wooden palisade that ringed Caer Gwent, its timbers weathered but sturdy. They set traps in the forest, pits lined with sharpened stakes, hidden under leaves. Bran and Owain took turns keeping watch from a hilltop, their eyes scanning the horizon for smoke or movement. The Britons knew the land better than any invader, their paths through the woods and bogs a secret passed down through generations. They marked their trails with subtle signs, a notched tree, a stone turned just so, known only to them. Yet the greatest challenge came not from Saxons but from within. The fever that had struck in December lingered, claiming another life, an old woman named Rian, whose songs had once filled the hall. Elwyn tended the sick tirelessly, her herbal knowledge a lifeline. She brewed teas from yarrow and willow bark, stored from summer's foraging, and applied poultices of honey and moss to festering wounds. But her supplies were dwindling, and the forest offered little in the early thaw. One night, as she sat by a fevered child, she whispered to Bran, "If spring doesn't come soon, we'll lose more than we can bear." The children, too, felt the weight of the season. Leo and Gwyn, though young, took on tasks beyond their years. Leo helped Bran check the snares, his small frame slipping through the snow to retrieve a frozen hare. Gwyn, only 6, gathered kindling from the edge of the forest, her tiny hands red from the cold. The village praised their efforts, for every small act mattered. The Britons taught their children early that survival was a shared burden, a lesson etched into their bones. As April approached, the signs of spring grew stronger. The snow retreated to the hilltops, and the first shoots of wild garlic pierced the earth. A flock of starlings filled the sky, their chatter a chorus of life. The village held a small rite by the river, a blend of old and new faiths. Cynric poured a libation of mead into the water, an offering to the river spirit, while Father Dewy, a wandering monk who had sheltered with them, blessed the gathering with a prayer to Christ. Bran, ever pragmatic, joined both, his heart torn between the gods of his fathers and the new faith spreading like wildfire. One morning, as the sun broke through the clouds, Owain returned from a scout with news. The Saxon tracks had vanished, likely turned back by the flooded paths of the thaw. The village exhaled, though they knew the reprieve might be temporary. That night, they gathered in the hall, their faces lit by a fire that burned brighter than it had in months. Arwen sang a song of renewal, her voice weaving hope into the smoky air. Elwyn passed around a loaf of flatbread, made from the last of the barley, but flavored with fresh, wild garlic. It was meager, but it tasted of survival. Bran stood outside later, Elwyn at his side, watching the stars emerge. The plow hung low, a guidepost for the planting season to come. "We made it," Elwyn said, her voice soft but fierce. Bran nodded, his hand finding hers. "Aye, but the land tests us still." He thought of the empty pits, the graves on the hill, the Saxon threat lurking beyond the horizon. Yet he thought, too, of the children's laughter, the fire's warmth, the village's unyielding spirit. Caer Gwent had faced the beast of winter and lived. They would face what came next. Historical and cultural context. This continuation draws on a wealth of archaeological and historical evidence to bring Dark Age Britain to life. The Late Antique Little Ice Age, c. 536 to 660 CE, is documented through dendrochronology and contemporary accounts, showing colder winters and shorter growing seasons that strained food supplies. Settlements like Caer Gwent, inspired by sites such as Dinas Powys or Cadbury Congressbury, were small but fortified, with palisades and roundhouses designed for warmth, as seen in excavations at Tintagel and Westow. Food storage in clay-lined pits and the use of preserved meat and foraged plants align with finds from these sites. Textiles were critical, with woolen clothing and furs reconstructed from fragments and descriptions in sources like Gildas Stoixidio et Conquesta Britanniae. Herbal remedies, such as yarrow and willow bark, reflect Celtic and early medieval ethnobotanical practices, while the blend of pagan and Christian rituals mirrors the transitional religious landscape of the period, evidenced by artifacts like cross-inscribed stones and sacred springs. The threat of Saxon raids is grounded in historical accounts of conflict between Britons and Anglo-Saxon settlers, as described in Bede's Ecclesiastical History. The first true day of spring came to Caer Gwent like a whispered promise. The sun, no longer a pale ghost, warmed the hills, and the snows had retreated to mere patches in the shadowed hollows. The River Wye roared with meltwater, its banks swollen and muddy, carrying twigs and leaves in its rush. Bran stood on the hill overlooking the village, his spear in hand, and watched the world awaken. Green shoots of wild garlic and sorrel pierced the earth, and a lone thrush sang from a budding hazel tree. The air smelled of damp soil and life, but Bran's jaw was tight. Spring brought hope, but it also bared the village's wounds, empty stores, weakened bodies, and the ever-present shadow of the Saxons. Inside their roundhouse, Elwyn knelt by the hearth, her hands steady as she ground the last handful of dried oats into meal. Leo and Gwyn sat nearby, mending a torn fishing net with twine made from nettles. The children were thinner than they should be, their cheeks hollow, but their eyes held a spark that winter had not extinguished. Elwyn's own face was etched with worry, though she hid it behind a soft hum. The granary pits were empty, and the village's last smoked fish had been eaten a week ago. Foraging had kept them alive, nettles, roots, and the occasional early mushroom, but hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at their strength. The Britons of Caer Gwent, a hearty mix of Romano-British and Celtic blood, had faced winters before, but this one had been a beast of legend. The late antique Little Ice Age, as later scholars would name it, had gripped the land with a cold that lingered into spring, shrinking harvests and driving game deep into the forests. Archaeological evidence, sparse crops in pollen records, shrunken tree rings, spoke of a world where survival was a daily battle. Yet the village endured, its roundhouses standing firm against the elements. Built low with thick wattle and daub walls, packed with straw for insulation, they trapped the heat of central hearths that burned day and night. Peat, cut from the bog by Owain and the younger men, had supplemented their dwindling firewood, its smoky haze a constant in the air. Clothing was their armor against the lingering chill. Elwyn and the women had woven wool into tunics and cloaks, dyed with woad's deep blue or madder's rust red, their looms creaking through the summer to prepare. Furs, deer, badger, and wolf lined their garments, the pelts stitched with bone needles by firelight. The children wore patched versions, their small cloaks a patchwork of love and necessity. Bran's boots, made from cured deer hide, were worn thin, but he refused to let Elwyn mend them yet. Others needed her skill more. The village's survival hinged on community. Cynric, the headman, was a pillar of stone despite his years, his voice carrying the weight of authority as he gathered the villagers in the communal hall. "Spring is here," he said one evening, his eyes scanning the gaunt faces lit by the fire. "But it brings no guarantees. We must plant, hunt, and watch the horizon." The hall, Its walls hung with faded tapestries of stags and rivers, was their heart, a place of shared meals and stories. Arwen, Cynric's wife, told tales of the old heroes, Max and Ledig, who dreamed of a lost empire, or the druids who spoke to the spirits of the land. The children, Leo and Gwyn among them, listened wide-eyed, their hunger briefly forgotten. But spring brought new dangers. The Saxon tracks Owain had spotted in March had vanished, but fresh signs appeared. A broken branch, a footprint in the mud, a wisp of smoke on the eastern horizon. The Saxons, pushing west from their lowland settlements, were bold in spring, when travel was easier. Caer Gwynedd clashed with them before, losing a herd of sheep and 2 men in a raid 3 summers past. The memory burned in Bran's chest as he sharpened his spear, its iron head traded from a smith in a distant hill fort. The village reinforced its defenses, repairing the wooden palisade that ringed the settlement and digging new pit traps in the forest paths. Elwyn taught the women to wield slings, their stones deadly when aimed true, while Cynric trained the older boys, like Leo, to carry messages or light signal fires. The greatest challenge, though, was rebuilding their strength. The winter had left the village fragile, 3 dead from fever, 2 from cold, and many more weakened by hunger. Elwyn, whose mother had been a healer, stretched her dwindling herbs to their limit. She brewed teas from willow bark for pain and yarrow for fever, applying moss and honey to wounds that refused to heal. But the forest was slow to yield new plants, and her stock of elderberry was gone. One night, as she tended a sick child in a neighboring roundhouse, she whispered to Bran, "We need a good harvest, or we'll not survive another winter." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her fear. The children bore their own burdens. Leo, at 10, joined the men on hunts, his sharp eyes spotting hare tracks in the muddy clearings. Gwyn, only 6, gathered kindling and wild greens, her small hands stained green from sorrel. The village praised their efforts, for every scrap counted. One day, Leo returned with a brace of pigeons, snared with a net he'd helped mend. The birds were small, but their meat, roasted over the fire, was a feast shared equally among the families. Gwyn beamed as Arwen praised her, tucking a sprig of wild garlic into her hair. The land itself was both ally and adversary. The Britons knew its secrets, where springs flowed even in drought, where fish hid in the river's eddies, how to read the stars for weather. Orion's belt, fading as spring advanced, warned of late frosts, while a circling hawk meant clear skies. They marked their paths with subtle signs, a notched oak, a cairn of stones, known only to them. Some still honored the old gods, leaving offerings of bread at sacred springs, while others, like Father Dewey, the Christian monk who had stayed through the winter, prayed to saints. Elwyn, caught between worlds, taught her children both, whispering to the river's spirit and tracing a cross in the dirt. Mid-April brought a crisis. A sudden frost, cruel and unseasonable, blackened the first barley shoots the village had planted. The loss was a blow, for the fields were their hope for the coming year. Cynric called a council, his face grim. "We must hunt and forage until the earth warms again," he said. Bran and Owain led a party into the forest, tracking a boar whose prints they'd found near a stream. The hunt was perilous. The boar was lean and desperate, its tusks sharp as blades. Owain took a gash to the leg, but they felled the beast, its meat enough to feed the village for days. The hide was cured for a new cloak, and the bones boiled for broth. Nothing wasted. The Saxon threat loomed closer. One dawn, a scout named Caddoc returned breathless, his cloak torn. "They're coming," he gasped. A band, maybe 20, with axes and shields, 2 days east. The village erupted into action. Sinric ordered the palisade reinforced with extra timbers, and the women hid knives and slings in their belts. Elwyn and Irwin moved the children to the deepest roundhouse, where they could shelter if the worst came. Bran and Owain climbed the hill to light a signal fire, its smoke a warning to allied settlements nearby. The Britons were outnumbered, but they knew the land, its bogs, its hidden paths, its choke points. The Saxons struck at dusk, their shouts breaking the twilight. Bran stood with the men at the palisade, his spear steady. The attackers were fierce, their axes gleaming, but the Britons fought with the desperation of those defending home. Elwyn and the women hurled stones from slings, one finding a Saxon's temple, dropping him in the mud. The traps in the forest slowed the enemy, and the village's archers, led by young Daffod, his arms scarred from the wolf attack, loosed arrows from the hill. The Saxons, caught off guard by the Britons' ferocity, faltered and fled, leaving 3 of their own in the mud. The victory was costly. 2 men were wounded, 1 badly, and a section of the palisade was splintered. But Caergwen held. That night, the village gathered in the hall, their faces weary but alive. Irwin sang a song of defiance, her voice rising over the crackle of the fire. Elwyn passed around a broth made from the boar, its warmth a balm for their battered spirits. Leo and Gwyn clung to Bran, their small hands gripping his cloak. "We're safe now, duh?" Gwyn asked, her voice small. Bran nodded, though he knew the Saxons would return. By May, the frost had lifted, and the fields were replanted with barley and oats. The river teemed with fish, and the forest offered early berries. The village began to heal, its people stronger with each day of sun. Bran and Elwyn stood by the river one evening, watching the water catch the light. "We're still here," Elwyn said, her hand in his. Bran looked at the village, the roundhouses standing proud, the children playing in the grass, the smoke rising from the hearths. "Aye," he said, "and we'll fight to stay." Historical and cultural grounding. This continuation is steeped in the realities of Dark Age Britain, drawing on archaeological and historical evidence. The Late Antique Little Ice Age, c. 536 to 660 CE, is documented through Treering data and pollen records showing colder, wetter conditions that disrupted agriculture, as seen in the stunted crops mentioned in the story. Settlements like Caer Gwent, inspired by hill forts like Dinas Powys or Cadbury Congresbury, were fortified with palisades and designed for defense, as evidenced by excavations at Tintagel and South Cadbury. Roundhouses, with their thick walls and central hearths, were built for warmth, as seen in sites like West Stow. Food scarcity and foraging practices are grounded in finds of grain pits, preserved fish, and wild plant remains, while herbal remedies like yarrow and willow bark reflect Celtic and early medieval ethnobotany. Clothing, reconstructed from textile fragments and texts like Gildas Dixidio, included wool and furs, essential for surviving cold springs. The Saxon thread is drawn from historical accounts, such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History, which describe Anglo-Saxon expansion and clashes with Britons. The blend of pagan and Christian practices mirrors the period's religious transition, seen in artifacts like cross-inscribed stones and ritual springs. The story emphasizes the Britons' communal resilience, inferred from village layouts and shared burials, and their intimate knowledge of the land, from hidden paths to animal signs. Children's roles in foraging and chores reflect the practical education of the time, while the palisade and traps align with defensive strategies found at hill forts. The narrative captures a people who, despite relentless challenges, held fast to their land and each other, their survival a testament to their unyielding spirit. The sun rose higher over Caer Gwent, its warmth coaxing life from the hills. By mid-May, the fields were green with barley and oats, their shoots fragile but stubborn, defying the late frost that had nearly broken the village's spirit. The River Wye sparkled under the clear sky, its banks alive with reeds and the darting shapes of fish. Bran stood at the edge of the planting fields, his hands caked with earth from sowing, and felt a flicker of hope. The winter had been a beast, its claws deep in their bones, but spring was a healer. Yet the scars of the season and the recent Saxon raid lingered, and Bran knew the fight for survival was far from over. Inside the roundhouse, Elwyn wove a new basket from willow branches, her fingers deft despite the weariness that clung to her. Leu and Gwyn sat nearby, sorting wild garlic and sorrel they'd gathered from the riverbank. The children's faces were less gaunt now, thanks to the fish and early greens, but their eyes still held the shadow of winter's hunger. Elwyn hummed a tune her mother had taught her, a song of the earth waking, to keep their spirits light. The granary pits remained empty, and though the forest and river offered more with each passing day, the village teetered on the edge of want. A single bad harvest could undo them. The Britons of Caer Gwent were a people forged in hardship. The late antique Little Ice Age had made the winters fiercer, with cold that lingered into spring, as seen in the stunted tree rings and sparse pollen records of the time. Their settlement, a cluster of roundhouses ringed by a wooden palisade, was built for endurance. The homes, low and thick-walled with wattle and daub, trapped the heat of central hearths that burned peat and wood. Owain, Bran's brother, had spent days repairing the palisade after the Saxon attack, his wounded legs slowing him, but not his resolve. "We'll not let them breach us again," he said, hammering a new timber into place, his breath clouding in the cool morning air. Clothing was their shield against the spring's lingering chill. The women, led by Elwyn and Arwen, had woven woolen tunics and cloaks through the summer, dyed with woad's blue and madder's red, their looms a constant hum in the village. Furs, deer, badger, and the boar hide from the recent hunt lined their garments, stitched with bone needles by firelight. Bran's cloak was patched but warm, and he'd given his best boots to Leu, whose feet had outgrown his old ones. Elwyn mended the children's clothes with scraps, her stitches tight as her love for them. The village's survival depended on shared effort. Cynric, the headman, was a figure of iron despite his graying beard, his voice rallying the people in the communal hall each week. The hall, its walls adorned with faded tapestries of rivers and stags, was their sanctuary, where they shared meager meals, fish stew, wild greens, and the occasional scrap of boar. Arwen's stories of heroes like Ambrosius or the old gods of the hills kept the children's eyes bright, even as their stomachs growled. "We are the land's blood," Cynric said one night, his gaze fierce. "We bend, but we do not break." Yet spring brought new trials. The Saxon raid had left 2 men wounded, one still hovering near death. Elwyn tended them, her herbal knowledge stretched thin. She brewed teas from nettle and comfrey, their leaves gathered fresh from the warming forest, and applied poultices of honey and moss to the wounds. Her stock of yarrow was gone, and she sent Leu and Gwyn to search for more, their small hands plucking the feathery leaves from damp clearings. "You're my eyes in the woods," she told them, her smile hiding her fear. The village needed every healer, for disease could spread faster than a fire in their weakened state. The fields were their hope, but also their gamble. The frost-blackened barley had been replanted, but the soil was poor, leached by years of hard use. Cynric organized the men to haul river mud to enrich the fields, a back-breaking task that left Bran's shoulders aching. The women, led by Elwyn, sowed seeds saved from last year's crop, their hands gentle but precise. They whispered prayers, some to the old earth spirits, some to the Christian God preached by Father Dewey, who lingered in the village, his robes patched but his faith unshaken. The The blend of beliefs was as much a part of Caer Gwent as the river, a quiet compromise in a world of change. The Saxon threat loomed like a storm cloud. Scouts reported no new tracks, but the memory of the raid was fresh, and Cynric doubled the watch. Bran and Owain took turns on the hill, their eyes scanning the eastern horizon for smoke or movement. The village had fortified its defenses, new stakes in the palisade, more pit traps in the forest paths, and a cache of stones for the women's slings. Leo, now trusted with a sling of his own, practiced daily, his stones striking a tree with growing accuracy. "If they come again, I'll fight," he told Bran, his voice steady, but his hands trembling. Bran clapped his shoulder, pride and fear warring in his chest. A new figure joined the village's efforts. Morwen, a young woman from a neighboring settlement destroyed by Saxons the previous year. She arrived on a rainy morning, her cloak tattered and her eyes haunted, carrying a bundle of iron tools traded from a distant smith. Cynric welcomed her, recognizing her skill as a weaver and her knowledge of the land. Morwen quickly proved her worth, weaving stronger nets for fishing and teaching the women to make snares from willow bark. "We had to learn fast where I came from," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Elwyn took her under her wing, sensing a kindred spirit, and the two women worked side by side, their laughter a rare brightness in the village. The children were the heart of Caer Gwent's future. Leo, at 10, joined the men on fishing trips, his sharp eyes spotting trout in the river's eddies. Gwyn, 6 and fierce, gathered berries and herbs, her small basket overflowing with blackberries by late May. The village celebrated their efforts, for every fish or berry was a step towards strength. One evening, Gwyn brought Elwyn a handful of early sloes, their tartness a promise of mead to come. "For the hall," Gwyn said, her smile wide. Elwyn hugged her, her heart swelling despite the ache of hunger. The land was both friend and foe. The Britons knew its secrets, where to find fish, how to spot a coming storm in the flight of crows, where springs bubbled even in drought. They marked their paths with notched trees and hidden cairns, a language only they spoke. Morwen shared tales of her old settlement's sacred oak, where offerings were left for the spirits, and Father Dewey countered with stories of St. Cuthbert, who tamed the wild seas. Bran, ever practical, honored both, leaving a crust of bread at a spring and crossing himself in the moonlight. The village needed every blessing it could get. June brought a glimmer of abundance. The river teemed with fish, and the forest offered mushrooms and berries. The barley fields grew tall, their green tips swaying in the breeze. Cynric called for a feast to mark the solstice, a celebration of survival. The village gathered by the river, where a fire roared under the stars. They roasted fish and a young deer felled by Owain, its meat shared equally. Iarwen sang of the sun's return, her voice weaving through the night, while Morwen taught the children a dance from her lost home, their feet kicking up dust. Elwyn and Bran stood at the edge, their hands entwined, watching Leo and Gwyn laugh. "We're mending," Elwyn whispered. Bran nodded, but his eyes strayed to the east, where the Saxon lands lay. The feast was interrupted by a shout. Caddoc, the scout, stumbled into the firelight, his face pale. "Riders," he gasped. "Not Saxons, Britons from the north. They seek aid." The village tensed, but Cynric raised a hand for calm. The riders, 3 men on shaggy ponies, brought news of a larger Saxon warband, massing in the lowlands. They sought allies to drive them back, offering iron and grain in return. Cynric's eyes narrowed. "We're weak, but we're not broken," he said. "We'll send men, but Caer Gwent comes first." Bran volunteered, his spear already in hand. Owain joined him, his limp barely noticeable. Elwyn gripped Bran's arm, her voice low. "Come back to us." He kissed her forehead, promising nothing but meaning everything. As the village prepared, Morwen stepped forward, offering to scout the eastern paths. "I know their tricks," she said, her eyes hard. Cynric nodded, and the village rallied, their unity a fire no winter could quench. As Bran and Owain rode out with the northerners, the village stood behind them, their fields green, their hearths warm. Caergwen had faced winter, hunger, and Saxons, and still it stood. Elwyn watched them go, Leu and Gwyn at her side, and whispered a prayer to the river and the cross. The land was waking, and so were they. Historical and cultural grounding. This continuation is rooted in the realities of Dark Age Britain, circa 5th to 6th centuries CE. The late Antique Little Ice Age, evidenced by Treering data and pollen records, brought colder springs and shorter growing seasons, challenging agriculture as depicted in the replanting efforts. Settlements like Caer Gwent, inspired by hill forts such as Dinah's Powys or South Cadbury, were fortified with palisades and roundhouses, their wattle and daub walls and central hearths designed for warmth, as seen in excavations at Tintagel and West Stow. Food practices, fishing, foraging, and small-scale farming align with finds of fish bones, wild plant remains, and grain pits. Textiles, reconstructed from fragments and texts like Gilda Stoixidio, included wool and furs, essential for spring's variable weather. Herbal remedies like nettle and camphor reflect Celtic ethnobotanical knowledge, while the coexistence of pagan and Christian practices mirrors the period's religious transition, seen in cross-inscribed stones and ritual springs. The Saxon thread is grounded in historical accounts, such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History, which describe Anglo-Saxon expansion and conflicts with Britons. Offanen. The summer sun burned bright over Caer Gwent, its light gilding the hills and coaxing the barley fields into golden waves. By late June, the River Wye flowed steady and clear, its banks thick with reeds and alive with the chatter of kingfishers. Bran had not yet returned from his mission with the Northern Riders, and Elwyn stood at the village's edge each dawn, her eyes scanning the western path for his familiar silhouette. The village buzzed with the work of summer, sowing, fishing, repairing, but beneath the activity lay a current of unease. The Saxon warband in the lowlands was still a threat, and Caer Gwent's survival hung on a fragile thread of hope and hard-won strength. Inside the roundhouse, Elwyn worked by the hearth, her hands stained with madder as she dyed a new batch of wool. Leu and Gwyn were outside, helping the other children gather rushes from the river to weave into mats. The children were stronger now, their faces filled out by fish, berries, and the first green barley porridge, but Elwyn's heart was heavy. Bran and Owain had been gone for 2 weeks, their mission to join the Northern Britons against the Saxons a gamble that could save or doom them all. She hummed a song of the old gods to steady herself, its rhythm a tether to the land that had sustained them through the brutal winter. The Britons of Caer Gwent were a people shaped by endurance. The late Antique Little Ice Age had left its mark, with colder springs and unpredictable summers, as evidenced by the sparse pollen records and stunted tree rings of the time. Their settlement, a cluster of roundhouses within a sturdy palisade, was built to withstand both weather and war. The homes, with their thick wattle and daub walls and straw-packed insulation, stood firm, their hearths now burning less fiercely in the warmer months. Owain's work on the palisade before he left had strengthened it, and the villagers kept it repaired, knowing the Saxons could strike at any time. Clothing had shifted with the season. The heavy furs of winter were stored, replaced by lighter woolen tunics and cloaks woven by Elwyn, Morwen, and the other women. The looms, set up outside in the summer light, sang with the clack of weights, producing cloth dyed with woads blue and elderberries purple. Morwen, the newcomer from the fallen settlement, had become a cornerstone of the village, her skill with weaving and snares invaluable. She'd crafted a new fishing net from flax, its tight weave doubling their catch from the river. "We survive by what we make," she told Elwyn, her hands never still. The village's heart was its community. Cynric, the headman, gathered the people in the communal hall each evening, where they shared meals of fish stew, wild greens, and the first barley bread. The hall's tapestries, faded but proud, depicted the rivers and hills that bound them to the land. Iorwen's stories of heroes like Vortigern or the spirits of the sacred springs kept the children enthralled, their laughter a balm for the village's wounds. "We've faced winter and Saxons," Cynric said one night, his voice steady as stone. "We'll face what comes next together." But the summer brought fresh challenges. The wounded from the Saxon raid were healing, thanks to Elwyn's care, but the village's herbal stores were nearly gone. She and Morwen foraged daily, scouring the forest for comfrey, yarrow, and wild mint, their baskets heavy with green but never enough. A fever lingered among the elderly, and Elwyn's hands trembled as she applied moss poultices to their fevered brows. "We need a healer's knowledge beyond mine," she admitted to Arwen one evening, her voice low. Arwen nodded, her eyes on the fire. "Father Dewey speaks of a holy man in the west, skilled in herbs. Perhaps we can send for him." The fields were the village's lifeline, but they demanded constant labor. The barley and oats, replanted after the spring frost, grew tall, but weeds choked the edges and birds stole the seeds. Cynric organized the women and children to scare off crows with slings and shouts, while the men hauled water from the river to irrigate the dry patches. Leo, now a wiry 10-year-old, worked alongside them, his sling felling a crow with a single stone. Gwyn, 6 and fierce, weeded with the other children, her small hands pulling roots with a determination that made Elwyn proud. "They're the future," Morwen said, watching them. Elwyn nodded, but her thoughts were with Bran, somewhere beyond the hills. The Saxon threat grew sharper. Scouts reported smoke in the east, and whispers of a larger warband reached Caer Gwent through traders passing up the river. The northern riders had promised iron and grain for the village's aid, but no word had come since Bran and Owain left. Cynric doubled the watch, posting Caddoc and young Daffod on the hill, their eyes sharp for any sign of danger. The village prepared as best they could, sharpening spears, mending the palisade, and setting new traps in the forest. Morwen, who had seen her own settlement burn, taught the women to make fire arrows, their tips wrapped in pitch-soaked cloth. "If they come, we'll light the night," she said, her voice hard with memory. A new figure arrived in early July. Idris, a grizzled trader from the western coast, his cart laden with salt, iron, and a few precious herbs. He was a wanderer, his face lined with stories, and he brought news of the wider world. "The Saxons grow bold in the east," he told Cynric, accepting a bowl of fish stew in the hall. "But the northern tribes are uniting, and your men fight with them." Elwyn's heart leapt at the mention of Bran, but Idris had no names, only rumors. He traded salt for a basket of Caer Gwent's woven cloth, and herbs, valerian and feverfew, for a deer hide. Elwyn clutched the herbs like treasure, knowing they could mean the difference between life and death. The children carried the village's spirit. Leo joined the men on fishing trips, his nets pulling trout and eels from the river. Gwyn and the other children gathered blackberries and sloes, their fingers stained purple. One evening, Leo returned with a hare, snared in a trap he'd set himself. The village roasted it, the meat shared equally, and Cynric praised Leo with a clap on the shoulder. "You're a man of Caer Gwent now," he said, and Leo stood taller, though his eyes searched the horizon for his father. The land was their ally and their teacher. The Britons knew its secrets, where fish schooled, where mushrooms hid under oak roots, how to read a storm in the flight of starlings. They marked their paths with subtle signs, a notched branch, a stone turned just so, known only to them. Morwen shared tales of her old settlement's sacred grove, where offerings were left for the earth spirits, while Father Dewey preached of Christ's mercy, his voice soft but unyielding. Elwyn, torn between worlds, taught her children both, leaving a sprig of holly at the river and whispering a prayer to the saints. The village needed every protection it could muster. Mid-July brought a miracle and a threat. Bran and Owain returned, weary but alive, their cloaks torn and their faces gaunt. The Northern Alliance had driven the Saxons back, scattering their warband, but at a cost. Many Britons had fallen, and the grain promised as payment was delayed by flooded rivers. Bran embraced Elwyn, his arms trembling, and held Leo and Gwyn close there. Laughter mingling with tears. "We held the line," he told Cynric, his voice rough. "But they'll come again." Owain, his leg wound reopened, collapsed by the hearth, tended by Elwyn's skilled hands. The miracle came in the form of a bountiful catch. The river, swollen with summer rains, teemed with salmon, their silver bodies leaping in the current. The village worked as one, casting nets and hauling fish until their arms ached. They smoked the surplus over fires of greenwood, the air thick with the scent of preservation. Morwen's nets proved their worth, and Idris, who lingered to trade, offered salt to cure the fish, asking only for a woven cloak in return. The stores began to fill, a fragile buffer against the next winter. But the threat followed close. Caddock spotted Saxon scouts in the forest, their tracks fresh in the mud. Cynric called a council, his face grim. "We've won a battle, but not the war," he said. "We must prepare for a siege." The village fortified the palisade, dug deeper traps, and trained the children to carry water or messages in a fight. Elwyn and Morwen worked late, weaving slings and binding arrows, their hands steady despite the fear in their hearts. Father Dewey blessed the village, his cross raised high, while Irwin left an offering of fish at the sacred spring, her voice low with prayer. As August dawned, the village gathered for a feast to honor the harvest's first fruits. The barley was nearly ready, and the fish stores were a promise of survival. They ate by the river, the firelight dancing on their faces. Irwin sang of the sun and the land, her voice weaving hope through the night. Bran held Elwyn's hand, Leu and Gwyn at their side, and for a moment, the Saxon shadow faded. "We're still here," Bran said, his voice a vow. Elwyn nodded, her eyes on the stars. "And we'll fight to stay." Historical and cultural grounding. This continuation is steeped in the realities of Dark Age Britain, c. 5th to 6th centuries c. The late Antique Little Ice Age, evidenced by Treering data and pollen records, disrupted agriculture with cold springs and wet summers, as seen in the village's struggle with crops and reliance on fishing. Settlements like Caer Gwent, inspired by hill forts such as Dinah's Powys or Cadbury Congressbury, were fortified with palisades and roundhouses, their wattle and daub walls and hearths designed for endurance, as excavated at Tintagel and West Stow. Food practices, fishing, foraging, and smoking fish align with finds of fish bones, wild plant remains, and storage pits. Textiles, reconstructed from fragments and texts like Gildas de Excidio, included lighter woolen tunics for summer, dyed with natural pigments like woad and elderberry. Herbal remedies like valerian and feverfew reflect Celtic ethnobotanical knowledge, while trade with figures like Idris mirrors the exchange of goods, salt, iron, seen in artifacts from Tintagel. The Saxon thread is grounded in historical accounts, such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History, which describe Anglo-Saxon expansion and Britain resistance, often through alliances like the one with the Northern Riders. The communal ethos, evident in shared meals and labor, is inferred from village layouts and collective burials, while children's roles in fishing and foraging reflect the practical education of the time. Morwen's integration draws on the mobility of Dark Age populations, as survivors join new communities, bringing skills like weaving, as seen in textile remains. The blend of pagan and Christian practices mirrors the period's religious transition, evidenced by cross-inscribed stones and ritual springs. The alliance with Northern Britons reflects the fragmented but cooperative resistance to Saxons, hinted at in early Welsh texts like the Gododdin. The late summer sun hung heavy over Caer Gwent, its golden light bathing the barley fields in a glow that promised plenty. By August's end, the crops stood tall, their heads heavy with grain, a stark contrast to the barren pits of winter. The River Wye flowed steadily, its waters alive with fish, and its banks thick with blackberries and sloes. Elwyn stood in the fields, her hands rough from reaping, and felt a cautious hope. Bran and Owain had returned from their northern campaign, battered but alive, and the village's stores were growing. Yet the threat of the Saxons loomed like a storm on the horizon, and the memory of last winter's hunger kept Elwyn's heart vigilant. Inside the roundhouse, Elwyn sorted the first harvest's yield, her fingers deft as she separated grain from chaff. Leu and Gwyn were outside, helping the other children carry sheaves to the communal hall for threshing. The children were stronger now, their faces bronzed by summer, but their eyes still carried the weight of the year's trials. Elwyn hummed a song of the harvest, its rhythm a prayer for abundance, but her thoughts strayed to the eastern woods, where Saxon scouts had been spotted. The village had survived winter and a raid, but the coming months would test them again. The Britons of Caer Gwent were a people forged in the crucible of survival. The late antique Little Ice Age had left the land unpredictable, with wet summers and early frosts, as evidenced by sparse pollen records and shrunken tree rings. Their settlement, a cluster of roundhouses within a fortified palisade, was a testament to their resilience. The homes, built low with wattle and daub walls packed with straw, were cooler now in the summer heat, their hearths burning low but never cold. Owain, his leg healing slowly, had led the men in reinforcing the palisade, adding sharpened stakes to deter raiders. "Let the Saxons come," he said, his grin fierce despite the limp. "They'll find us ready." Clothing had lightened with the season, the heavy furs of winter replaced by woolen tunics and cloaks woven by Elwyn, Morwen, and the women. The looms, now set up in the shade of oaks, produced cloth dyed with elderberries purple and matters red, their colors a defiance of the gray past. Morwen, the newcomer whose weaving had strengthened the village, worked tirelessly, her nets and snares doubling the fish and game brought in. She'd also taught the children to make simple baskets, their small hands weaving rushes with growing skill. "Every thread counts," she told Elwyn, her eyes bright with purpose. Community was the village's backbone. Cynric, the headman, gathered the people nightly in the communal hall, where they shared meals of barley bread, smoked salmon, and blackberry preserves. The hall's tapestries, woven with images of stags and rivers, fluttered in the warm breeze, a reminder of their bond to the land. Arwen's stories of heroes like Maxen Ledig or the spirits in the hills lifted spirits, while Father Dewey, the Christian monk, spoke of hope and salvation, his patched robes a contrast to his steady voice. "We are one people," Cynric said, his gray eyes sweeping the hall. "Winter taught us that and will not forget." But autumn's approach brought new burdens. The harvest, though promising, was not enough to fill the granary pits to last another winter. The men worked from dawn to dusk, reaping barley and oats, while the women and children threshed and stored the grain in clay-lined pits. Elwyn and Morwen led the foraging, gathering sloes, hazelnuts, and wild apples to supplement the stores. The forest was generous, but not boundless, and Elwyn's herbal supplies, crucial for the fever season, were still low. Idris, the trader, had promised to return with more herbs, but his cart had not been seen since July. "We need him soon," Elwyn told Arwen, her hands crushing comfrey for a poultice. "The fever will come with the rains." The Saxon threat grew sharper. Caddock, the scout, reported fresh tracks in the eastern forest, boot prints and broken branches, signs of a warband probing the land. The Northern Alliance had scattered one Saxon force, but Bran's tales of the campaign painted a grim picture. The lowlands were thick with settlers, their axes hungry for Britain land. Cynric doubled the watch, posting Dafydd and Lew on the hill, their slings ready. The village prepared for a siege, digging new pit traps and stockpiling stones for the women's slings. Morwen, her face set with the memory of her burned home, crafted fire arrows, their pitch-soaked tips a promise of defiance. "They'll not take us easily," she said, her voice ablade. A new challenge emerged within the village: doubt. Some of the younger men, led by a hot-headed youth named Rhys, questioned Cynric's leadership. "We should strike the Saxons first," Rhys argued in the hall, his voice loud. Waiting makes us pray. Cynric's gaze was steady, but his words were iron. We fight on our terms, on our land. Rashness will bury us. Bran backed Cynric, his presence calming the younger men, but the tension lingered. Elwyn, watching from the shadows, feared division could weaken them more than any Saxon blade. The children were the village's heart. Leo, now trusted with a spear, joined the men on hunts, his aim true enough to fell a deer with Dafydd's help. Gwyn, small but fierce, gathered sloes with the other children, her basket brimming with purple fruit. One evening, she brought Elwyn a handful of hazelnuts, her smile bright. For winter, she said, and Elwyn hugged her, her throat tight. The children's efforts were celebrated, their small victories a reminder of why the village fought. Leo's sling had become a weapon, and he practiced daily, his stones striking a stump with deadly precision. I'll protect you, Ma, he told Elwyn, his voice earnest. She nodded, her heart torn between pride and fear. The land was their guide, and their test. The Britons knew its rhythms, where salmon leaped, where mushrooms hid, how to read a storm in the flight of geese. They marked their paths with hidden signs, a notched oak, a cairn of stones, known only to them. Morwen shared stories of her old settlement's sacred grove, while Father Dewey spoke of saints who walked the wild places. Elwyn, caught between faiths, left a loaf at the river's edge and whispered a prayer to Christ, her hands tracing a cross in the air. The village needed every blessing, for the rains were coming, and with them the fever. September brought a turning point. Idris returned, his cart rattling with salt, iron, and a sack of precious herbs, yarrow, feverfew, and valerian. Elwyn nearly wept at the sight, her hands trembling as she sorted the leaves. Idris also brought news. The Northern Alliance was holding, but the Saxons were massing again, their war band bolstered by mercenaries from across the sea. You've got time, but not much, he warned Cynric, accepting a woven blanket in trade. The village welcomed him with a feast of roasted deer and barley bread, Arwen's song of the harvest rising over the fire. Bran, his arm around Elwyn, felt the weight of what was coming. We'll need more than spears, he murmured. She nodded, her eyes on the children dancing in the firelight. The threat became reality at dawn. Cadoc's horn woke the village, its wail cutting through the mist. A Saxon warband, larger than before, perhaps 30 men, emerged from the eastern forest, their shields glinting. Cynric rallied the village, his voice a thunderclap. To the palisade. Bran and Owain took their places, spears ready, while Elwyn and Morwen led the women to the hill, their slings and fire arrows poised. Leo, too young to fight but too old to hide, carried water to the men, his face pale but set. Gwyn and the children sheltered in the deepest roundhouse, their small voices singing to keep fear at bay. The Saxons charged, their axes hacking at the palisade. The Britons fought with the ferocity of those defending home. Morwen's fire arrows lit the dawn, one catching a Saxon's cloak, sending him screaming into the mud. Elwyn's sling felled another, her stone striking his helm. The pit traps claimed 2 more, their cries echoing as they fell. Bran and Owain held the gate, their spears a blur, while Dafydd's arrows found their marks from the hill. The Saxons, bloodied and surprised by the village's resolve, retreated, leaving 6 of their own in the dirt. The victory was hard-won. Owain's leg wound reopened, and one man, old Gwillem, fell to an axe, his body carried to the hall with honor. The palisade was battered, but it held. That night, the village gathered by the river, their faces weary but unbroken. Arwen sang of defiance, her voice weaving strength into the darkness. Elwyn tended the wounded, her herbs now plentiful thanks to Idris, while Morwen repaired nets torn in the fight. Bran held Leo and Gwyn close, their warmth a reminder of why he fought. "We're still here," he said, his voice steady. Elwyn met his eyes, her hand in his. "And we'll stay." Historical and cultural grounding. This continuation is rooted in the realities of Dark Age Britain, c. 5th to 6th centuries CE. The late antique Little Ice Age, evidenced by Treering data and pollen records, brought wet summers and early frosts, challenging harvests as depicted in the story's focus on barley and foraging. Settlements like Caer Gwent, inspired by hill forts like Dinah's Powys or South Cadbury, were fortified with palisades and roundhouses, their wattle and daub walls built for endurance, as seen in excavations at Tintagel and West Stow. Food practices, fishing, foraging, and grain storage in clay-lined pits align with archaeological finds of fish bones, wild plant remains, and storage pits. Textiles, reconstructed from fragments and texts like Gildas Stoixidio, included woolen tunics dyed with natural pigments like elderberry and madder, essential for summer and autumn work. Herbal remedies like yarrow and feverfew reflect Celtic ethnobotanical knowledge, while trade with figures like Idris mirrors the exchange of salt and iron seen in artifacts from Tintagel. The Saxon thread is grounded in historical accounts, such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History, which describe Anglo-Saxon expansion and Britain resistance through alliances and fortified villages. The communal ethos, evident in shared meals and labor, is inferred from village layouts and collective burials, while children's roles in harvesting and foraging reflect the practical education of the time. Morwen's contributions draw on the mobility of Dark Age populations, as survivors brought skills like weaving to new communities. The tension with Rhys reflects the social dynamics of small settlements, where leadership was tested, as hinted in early Welsh texts like the Gododdin. The blend of pagan and Christian practices mirrors the period's religious transition, seen in cross-inscribed stones and ritual springs. The autumn winds swept through Caer Gwent, carrying the scent of ripe grain and damp earth. By early October, the barley and oat fields had been reaped, their yields stored in clay-lined pits that offered a fragile promise against the coming winter. The River Wye ran swift, its banks thick with rushes and the last of the season's blackberries. Elwyn stood by the river, her cloak pulled tight against the chill, and watched the water catch the fading light. The village had survived the Saxon siege, but the cost lingered: Gwilym's grave on the hill, Owain's worsening wound, and the ever-present fear of another attack. Brand, beside her, rested a hand on her shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We've held," he said, his voice low, "but the land demands more." Inside their roundhouse, Elwyn sorted the harvest's final haul, her hands steady as she packed grain into baskets. Leo and Gwyn were outside, helping the other children gather kindling for the winter fires. The children were the village's heartbeat, their faces now fuller from summer's bounty, but their eyes held the weight of the siege. Leo, at 10, carried a spear with pride, his sling always at his belt, while Gwyn, 6 and fierce, wove rushes into mats with a skill that rivaled the women. Elwyn hummed a song of the old gods, its melody a thread of strength, but her thoughts strayed to the empty spaces in the granary pits. The harvest was better than last year's, but not enough to banish the specter of hunger. The Britons of Caer Gwent were a people tempered by trial. The late antique Little Ice Age had made autumns unpredictable, with early frosts and heavy rains, as evidenced by sparse pollen records and stunted tree rings. Their settlement, a cluster of roundhouses within a battered but sturdy palisade, stood as a testament to their defiance. The homes, with their wattle and daub walls packed with straw, were being prepared for winter, their roofs repaired with fresh thatch. Owain, despite his festering leg wound, worked alongside the men, reinforcing the palisade with new timbers. "I'll not let Saxons or cold break us," he said, his grin strained but unyielding. Clothing shifted with the season's chill. The light tunics of summer gave way to heavier woolen cloaks, woven by Elwyn, Morwen, and the women on looms that creaked under the strain. The cloth, dyed with Wode's deep blue and Matter's rust red, was lined with furs, deer, badger, and the boar hide from the spring hunt. Morwen, whose weaving had become the village's pride, crafted a new cloak for Cynric, its edges stitched with intricate patterns that told of rivers and stars. "It's a shield of thread," she said, handing it to the headman. Her skill, born from her lost settlement, had woven her into Caergwent's heart, and Elwyn counted her as a sister. Community was their strength. Cynric gathered the village nightly in the communal hall, where they shared meals of barley porridge, smoked fish, and slow preserves. The hall's tapestries, faded but vibrant with stories of the land, fluttered in the draught. Arwen's tales of heroes like Ambrosius or the spirits in the sacred springs lifted the children's spirits, while Father Dewey, the Christian monk, spoke of faith and redemption, his voice a quiet fire. "We are bound by more than blood," Cynric said, his gray beard catching the firelight. "We are Caergwent, and we endure." But the aftermath of the siege brought new strains. Owain's wound, worsened by the fight, refused to heal, and Elwyn's herbs, bolstered by Idris's trade, could only slow the fever. She and Morwen tended him by night, applying poultices of yarrow and honey, but his strength waned. "I'll not leave you yet," he told Bran, his voice weak but fierce. Elwyn, her hands trembling, confided in Morwen, "If we lose him, the village loses more than a man." Morwen nodded, her eyes haunted by her own losses. They foraged tirelessly, seeking rare herbs like vervain, but the forest grew stingy as autumn deepened. The Saxon threat loomed larger. Caddock scouts reported no new tracks, but rumors from traders spoke of a warband gathering in the lowlands, bolstered by warriors from across the sea. The Northern Alliance, weakened by the summer's battles, sent no aid, and the promised grain had not arrived. Cynric called a council, his face carved with worry. "We must prepare for winter and war," he said. The village doubled its efforts, smoking fish, drying apples, and repairing the palisade's splintered sections. Morwen and Elwyn crafted more fire arrows, their pitch-soaked tips a silent vow, while the men sharpened spears and axes traded from Idris. Internal tensions flared. Rhys, the young firebrand, grew bolder, his voice loud in the hall. "We should take the fight to the Saxons," he argued, his fist pounding the table. "Hiding makes us weak." Cynric's gaze was steel. "We fight to protect, not to die in vain." Bran, torn between loyalty to Cynric and understanding Rhys's frustration, mediated, his calm words easing the younger man's anger. But the rift lingered, and Elwyn feared it could fracture the village when unity was their shield. The children carried hope amid the strain. Leo, now a skilled hunter, returned with a brace of hares, his snares set with Morwen's guidance. Gwyn wove baskets for the harvest, her small hands steady, and brought Elwyn a handful of late sloes, their tartness a promise of mead. "For the cold," she said, her smile bright. The village praised their efforts, and Cynric gifted Leo a bone-handled knife, its blade etched with a stag. "Your Caergwent's blood," he said, and Leo stood taller, though his eyes searched for Owain, who grew weaker by the day. The land was their guide and their trial. The Britons knew its secrets, where fish hid in the river's eddies, where hazelnuts fell in the forest, how to read a storm in the flight of crows. They marked their paths with notched trees and hidden cairns, a language only they spoke. Morwen shared tales of her old settlement's sacred hill, while Father Dewey preached of saints who walked the wilds. Elwyn, straddling both worlds, left a stone at the river's edge and whispered a prayer to Christ, her faith a blend of earth and sky. The village needed every protection, for the rains had begun, bringing the threat of fever. October brought a glimmer of hope and a new danger. Idris returned, his cart heavy with salt, iron, and a rare gift, a sack of rye seeds, heartier than barley for the cold earth. Elwyn embraced him, her gratitude spilling over as she sorted the herbs he brought: valerian, feverfew, and a sprig of rare horehound. "For Owain," she said, her voice tight. Idris also brought grim news. The Saxon warband was moving, their numbers swelling, and they aimed to strike before winter locked the land. "Fortify and pray," he said, accepting a woven cloak in trade. The village prepared with fierce resolve. Cynric organized the men to deepen the pit traps and reinforce the palisade with stones. Morwen and Elwyn trained the women and older children, including Lo, to use slings and fire arrows, their aim growing deadly. Bran led hunts to bolster the stores, felling a deer whose meat was smoked and shared. But Owain's decline cast a shadow. One night, as the rains pounded the thatch, he called Bran and Elwyn to his side. "Keep Caergwent strong," he whispered, his hand gripping Bran's. By dawn, he was gone, his body laid on the hill with Gwilym's, a cairn marking his rest. The loss shook the village, but it forged them anew. Rhys, chastened by Owain's death, swore loyalty to Cynric. His anger turned to purpose. The village gathered by the river, their grief raw, but their unity unbreakable. Iarwen sang of the fallen, her voice weaving Owain's name into the stars, while Father Dewy blessed the grave. Elwyn, her herbs saving others but not Owain, clung to Bran, her tears silent. Leu and Gwyn stood close, their small hands in hers, and Lo vowed, "I'll fight for him, Ma." As November loomed, the village stood ready. The granary pits were fuller, the palisades stronger, and the people bound by loss and hope. The Saxon warband was near, smoke rose in the east, but Caergwent was no easy prey. Bran and Elwyn stood by the hall, watching the children play in the fading light. "We've lost much," Elwyn said, her voice steady. Bran nodded, his hand on his spear. "But we've gained more. We're still here." The wind carried the scent of rain and winter, but Caergwent's fire burned bright. Historical and cultural grounding. This continuation is steeped in the realities of Dark Age Britain, c. 5th to 6th centuries c. The late Antique Little Ice Age, evidenced by Treering data and pollen records, brought wet autumns and early frosts, challenging harvests as depicted in the story's focus on grain storage and foraging. Settlements like Caergwent, inspired by hill forts like Dinah's Powys or South Cadbury, were fortified with palisades and roundhouses, their wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs built for endurance, as seen in excavations at Tintagel and West Stow. Food practices, smoking fish, drying fruit, and storing grain in clay-lined pits, align with finds of fish bones, wild plant remains, and storage pits. Textiles, reconstructed from fragments and texts like Gilda Stoixidio, included woolen cloaks dyed with woad and madder, lined with furs for autumn's chill. Herbal remedies like valerian and horehound reflect Celtic ethnobotanical knowledge, while trade with Idris mirrors the exchange of salt, iron, and seeds seen in artifacts from Tintagel. The Saxon thread is grounded in historical accounts, such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History, which describe Anglo-Saxon expansion and Britain resistance through fortified villages and alliances. The communal ethos, evident in shared meals and labor, is inferred from village layouts and collective burials, while children's roles in harvesting and weaving reflect the practical education of the time. Morwen's integration draws on the mobility of Dark Age populations, as survivors brought skills like weaving to new communities. The tension with Rhys reflects the social dynamics of small settlements, where leadership was tested, as hinted in early Welsh texts like the Gododdin. The blend of pagan and Christian practices mirrors the period's religious transition, seen in cross-inscribed stones and ritual springs, The first frost of November dusted the hills around Caer Gwent, a glittering warning of the winter to come. The barley and oat fields, now reaped and stored, had filled the clay-lined granary pits with a modest bounty, enough to offer hope, but not certainty. The River Wye ran cold, its surface shimmering with thin ice at dawn, though its depths still yielded fish for the village's nets. Elwyn stood by the palisade, her breath clouding in the chill air, and scanned the eastern forest for signs of the Saxon warband. Smoke had been sighted for 3 days running, a dark omen that kept the village on edge. Brand, beside her, gripped his spear, his face etched with resolve. "We've faced winter before," he said, his voice steady. "We'll face this too." Inside their roundhouse, Elwyn worked by the hearth, her hands sorting dried apples and sloes to stretch the winter stores. Leo and Gwyn were outside, helping the other children stack firewood under Cynric's watchful eye. The children were the village's lifeblood, their faces hardened by the year's trials, but bright with purpose. Leo, at 10, carried his bone-handled knife with pride, his sling a constant companion, while Gwyn, 6 and fierce, wove rush baskets for kindling, her small hands deft. Elwyn hummed a song of the old gods, its rhythm a shield against fear, but her heart ached for Owain, whose grave on the hill was a fresh wound. The village had survived the siege, but the cost, Gwillem, Owain, and the battered palisade, hung heavy. The Britons of Caer Gwent were a people carved by adversity. The late antique Little Ice Age had made winters brutal, with frost creeping early and lingering late, as evidenced by sparse pollen records and stunted tree rings. Their settlement, a cluster of roundhouses within a fortified palisade, stood as a defiant outpost. The homes, with their wattle and daub walls packed with straw and clay, were sealed against the cold, their hearths burning peat and wood to ward off the chill. The palisade, scarred from the Saxon attack, had been reinforced with new timbers and stones, a task led by Bran in Owain's absence. "For my brother," he said, driving a stake into the earth, his hands blistered but unyielding. Clothing was their armor against the deepening cold. The women, led by Elwyn and Morwen, had woven heavy woolen cloaks, dyed with Wode's blue and Matter's rust red, lined with furs from deer and badger. Morwen's skill had produced a cloak for Leo, its edges stitched with a pattern of running hares, a gift that made his eyes shine. "It'll keep you warm when you scout," she told him, her voice soft but firm. Her weaving, born from her lost settlement, had become Caer Gwent's strength, and her presence steadied the village like a second hearth. Community was their fortress. Cynric, the headman, gathered the village nightly in the communal hall, where they shared meals of barley porridge, smoked fish, and hazelnut cakes. The hall's tapestries, woven with images of rivers and stags, glowed in the firelight, a reminder of their bond to the land. Arwen's stories of heroes like Ambrosius or the spirits in the sacred springs wove hope into the dark, while Father Dewey, the Christian monk, spoke of endurance and grace, his patched robes a testament to his faith. "We are Caer Gwent," Cynric said, his voice a rumble. "We bend, but we do not break." The aftermath of Owain's loss tested that unity. His death had silenced Rhys's rebellion, but a quiet unease lingered. Some whispered that Cynric's caution, fortifying rather than striking, invited danger. Brand, loyal to the headman, quelled the murmurs, his calm presence a bridge between Cynric and the younger men. Elwyn, tending the sick with Morwen, saw the village's strength in its shared grief. She used Idris's herbs, yarrow, feverfew, and horehound, to treat the fever that crept in with the rains, but her supplies were dwindling again. "We need a healer from the west," she told Morwen, her hands crushing valerian. Morwen nodded, her eyes distant. My mother knew such a man before the Saxons came. The Saxon threat was no longer a rumor. Caddock scouts reported a warband massing in the lowlands, their numbers swollen by mercenaries, perhaps 40 strong, armed with axes and shields. The Northern Alliance, weakened by losses, sent no aid, and the promised grain remained a dream. Cynric called a council, his face grim. They'll strike before winter locks the paths, he said. The village prepared with fierce resolve, digging deeper pit traps, stockpiling stones for slings, and crafting more fire arrows under Morwen's guidance. Elwyn trained the women and older children, including Leo, to aim true, their slings whistling in the crisp air. A new challenge emerged, a flood. Heavy rains swelled the River Wye, its waters breaching the banks and flooding the lower fields. The granary pits, though clay-lined, were at risk, and the village worked frantically to dig trenches and divert the water. Bran and the men hauled stones to reinforce the banks, their boots sinking in mud, while Elwyn and Morwen led the women to salvage grain from the threatened pits. Leo and Gwyn carried baskets to higher ground, their small frames bent under the weight. "We can't lose this," Elwyn said, her voice fierce as she worked. The flood receded, but it damaged a third of the stores, a blow that tightened the village's belt. The children were the village's hope. Leo, now a scout, ventured with Caddock to the forest's edge, his sharp eyes spotting Saxon tracks in the mud. Gwyn wove baskets and gathered kindling, her small hands stained with berry juice. One evening, Leo returned with a pheasant, snared with Morwen's teaching, its feathers a gift for Iorwen's storytelling. "For Owain," he said, laying it at Cynric's feet. The headman nodded, his eyes soft. "You're his blood, lad." Gwyn, watching, vowed to make a basket for the hall, her determination a spark in the gathering dark. The land was their guide and their test. The Britons knew its secrets, where fish schooled, where mushrooms hid, how to read a storm in the flight of geese. They marked their paths with notched oaks and hidden cairns, a language only they spoke. Morwen shared tales of her old settlement's sacred spring, while Father Dewey spoke of saints who tamed the wilds. Elwyn, straddling both faiths, left a loaf at the river and traced a cross in the dirt, her prayers a blend of earth and sky. The village needed every blessing, for the fever was spreading, and the Saxons were close. November's end brought a moment of light and a gathering storm. Idris, the trader, returned, his cart heavy with salt, iron, and a rare treasure. A healer named Branwen, a woman from the western hills with eyes like flint and a satchel of herbs. Elwyn embraced her, relief flooding her as Branwen sorted horehound and elderberry. "You've kept them alive," Branwen told her, her voice warm. Idris also brought grim news. The Saxon warband was a day away, their fires lighting the eastern horizon. "Fortify and fight," he said, accepting a woven blanket in trade. The village prepared for war. Cynric rallied the men to the palisade, their spears and axes ready. Bran led the archers, his bow drawn from a yew tree felled in spring. Elwyn and Morwen armed the women with slings and fire arrows, their hands steady despite the fear. Leo, too young to fight but too old to hide, carried stones to the hill, his sling at his belt. Gwyn and the children sheltered in the deepest roundhouse, their voices singing Iorwen's songs to drown out the dread. Branwen tended the sick, her herbs a lifeline against the fever. The Saxons struck at dawn, their war cries shattering the frost. 40 strong, they charged the palisade, their axes biting wood. The Britons fought with the ferocity of those defending home. Morwen's fire arrows lit the morning, one catching a Saxon's shield, while Elwyn's sling felled another, her stone striking true. Bran and Cynric held the gate, their spears a wall, while Daffod's arrows flew from the hill. The pit traps claimed 4, their screams echoing. Leo, caught in the chaos, hurled a stone that stunned a Saxon, saving Cadoc's life. The village's unity was their strength, and the Saxons, bloodied and broken, retreated, leaving 10 dead in the mud. The victory was costly. 2 men fell, and the palisade was splintered. Branwen's herbs saved many, but the fever claimed an elder. The village buried their dead on the hill, their graves marked with stones. That night, they gathered in the hall, their faces weary but unbroken. Arwen sang of Owain and the fallen, her voice weaving their names into the stars. Elwyn, her hands stained with herbs and blood, held Bran, Leo, and Gwyn close. "We're still here," she said, her voice a vow. Bran nodded, his eyes on the fire. "And we'll stay." Historical and cultural grounding. This continuation is rooted in the realities of Dark Age Britain, c. 5th to 6th centuries c. The late Antique Little Ice Age, evidenced by Treering data and pollen records, brought early frosts and heavy rains, threatening harvests and flooding fields, as depicted in the story's flood and granary struggles. Settlements like Caer Gwent, inspired by hill forts like Dinas Powys or South Cadbury, were fortified with palisades and roundhouses, their wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs built for endurance, as seen in excavations at Tintagel and West Stow. Food practices, smoking fish, drying fruit, and storing grain in clay-lined pits, align with finds of fish bones, wild plant remains, and storage pits. Textiles, reconstructed from fragments and texts like Gilda Stoixidio, included woolen cloaks dyed with woad and madder, lined with furs for winter's approach. Herbal remedies like horehound and elderberry reflect Celtic ethnobotanical knowledge, while trade with Idris and the arrival of Branwen mirror the exchange of goods and mobility of skilled individuals, as seen in artifacts from Tintagel. The Saxon thread is grounded in historical accounts, such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History, which describe Anglo-Saxon expansion and Britain resistance through fortified villages and desperate battles. The communal ethos, evident in shared meals and labor, is inferred from village layouts and collective burials, while children's roles in scouting and weaving reflect the practical education of the time. Morwen's contributions draw on the mobility of Dark Age populations, as survivors brought skills to new communities. The tension with Rhys reflects the social dynamics of small settlements, where leadership was tested, as hinted in early Welsh texts like the Gododdin. The blend of pagan and Christian practices mirrors the period's religious transition, seen in cross-inscribed stones and ritual springs. The winter of Caer Gwent descended like a shroud, its frost locking the hills in a glittering vice. By late December, the River Wye was a ribbon of ice, its surface cracked only by the village's daily efforts to fetch water. The granary pits, though fuller than last year, were rationed tightly, their barley and oats doled out in meager portions. Elwyn stood by the hearth in their roundhouse, her breath visible in the dim light, stirring a pot of thin pottage made from grain and dried nettles. Bran, beside her, sharpened his spear, his hands steady despite the ache of old wounds. The Saxon warband had been repelled, but their threat lingered in the eastern shadows, and the village bore the scars of battle. 2 men dead, the palisade battered, and Owain's absence a wound that would not heal. Outside, Leo and Gwyn huddled with the other children, stacking peat and firewood under the eaves of the communal hall. The children were the village's spark, their faces pale but fierce, hardened by the year's trials. Leo, at 10, carried his bone-handled knife with a warrior's pride, his sling always ready, while Gwyn, 6 and unyielding, wove rush mats to insulate the roundhouses, her small hands chapped but tireless. Elwyn hummed a song of the old gods, its melody a thread of warmth, but her heart was heavy with worry. The fever, kept at bay by Branwen's herbs, threatened to return, and the stores, though bolstered by the autumn harvest, were not enough to banish hunger's shadow. The Britons of Caer Gwent were a people forged in the crucible of survival. The late antique Little Ice Age had made winters relentless, with temperatures plunging and snow piling high, as evidenced by sparse pollen records and stunted tree rings. Their settlement, a cluster of roundhouses within a fortified palisade, stood defiant against the cold. The homes, with their wattle-end daub walls packed with straw and clay, were sealed tight, their hearths burning peat and wood day and night. The palisade, scarred from the Saxon siege, had been repaired with stones and timbers, a task led by Bran and Dafydd in Owain's memory. "For Caer Gwent," Bran said, his voice rough as he drove a stake into the frozen earth. Clothing was their shield against the biting cold. Elwyn Morwen and the women had woven heavy woolen cloaks, dyed with woad's deep blue and madder's rust red, lined with furs from deer, badger, and the boar felled in spring. Morwen's skill had crafted a new cloak for Gwyn, its edges stitched with a pattern of stars, a gift that made the girl's eyes shine. "It'll keep you warm when you fetch kindling," Morwen told her, her voice soft but steady. Her weaving, a legacy of her lost settlement, was a lifeline, and her presence anchored the village like a second hearth. Community was their fortress. Cynric, the headman, gathered the village nightly in the communal hall, where they shared meals of barley pottage, smoked fish, and hazelnut cakes. The hall's tapestries, woven with images of rivers and stags, glowed in the firelight, a reminder of their bond to the land. Arwen's stories of heroes like Maxen Ledig or the spirits in the sacred springs wove hope into the dark, while Father Dewey, the Christian monk, spoke of endurance and salvation, his patched robes a testament to his faith. "We are one," Cynric said, his gray eyes fierce. "Winter and Saxons cannot break us." The aftermath of the battle tested that unity. The loss of two men, Gwilym and now Caradoc, felled in the siege, had left gaps in the village's strength. Owain's death still haunted Bran, who carried his brother's spear as a vow. Elwyn and Branwen, the western healer, tended the wounded and sick, their herbs, yarrow, feverfew, and horehound, stretched thin. The fever had claimed an elder, and Branwen's knowledge, though vast, could not replace the dwindling supplies. "We need more," Elwyn told Morwen, her hands crushing valerian by the hearth. Morwen, her eyes shadowed by her own losses, nodded. "Idris may return, but the snows may keep him away." The Saxon threat was a constant shadow. Caddock scouts, braving the snow, reported no new tracks, but the Warbans' fires still burned in the east, a reminder of their hunger for Britain land. The Northern Alliance, weakened by losses, had sent no word, and the promised grain was a fading hope. Cynric called a council, his face carved with resolve. "We must hold until spring," he said. The village fortified the palisade, dug deeper traps, and stockpiled stones for slings. Morwen and Elwyn crafted more fire arrows, their pitch-soaked tips a silent promise, while Bran trained the men and older boys, including Lo, to wield spears with precision. A new challenge emerged, a wolf pack, driven by hunger, prowled closer to the village. Their howls pierced the night, chilling the children's sleep. Bran and Dafydd led a hunting party, their torches flaring in the snow, to drive the wolves back. Lo, against Bran's wishes, followed, his sling ready. The hunt was fierce. One wolf fell to Bran's spear, but another grazed Dafydd's arm, its claws leaving a bloody mark. Lo's stone struck true, stunning a wolf long enough for Bran to finish it. The village gained 2 pelts and meat, but the cost was high. Dafydd's wound festered, and Branwen's herbs were stretched thinner. "You're brave, lad," Bran told Lo, his voice torn between pride and fear. Lo nodded, his eyes older than his years. The children were the village's hope. Leo, now a scout, ventured with Caddock to check snares, his sharp eyes spotting hare tracks in the snow. Gwyn gathered kindling and dried herbs, her small hands stained with nettle juice. One evening, she brought Elwyn a basket of frozen sloes, her smile bright despite the cold. "For mead," she said, and Elwyn hugged her, her heart swelling. The village celebrated their efforts, and Cynric gifted Gwyn a carved wooden bird, its wings etched with care. "Your care, Gwen's heart," he said, and Gwyn beamed, though her thoughts were with Lo, who risked the snows daily. The land was their guide and their trial. The Britons knew its secrets, where springs bubbled under ice, where mushrooms hid in frozen hollows, how to read a blizzard in the flight of ravens. They marked their paths with notched oaks and hidden cairns, a language only they spoke. Morwen shared tales of her old settlement's sacred grove, while Father Dewey preached of saints who walked the wilds. Elwyn, straddling both faiths, left a crust of bread at the river and traced a cross in the snow, her prayers a blend of earth and sky. The village needed every blessing, for the fever was spreading, and the Saxons were near. January brought a moment of light and a gathering storm. Idris, the trader, defied the snows to return, his cart heavy with salt, iron, and a rare gift, a bundle of dried herbs from the western hills. Elwyn and Branwen embraced him, their gratitude spilling over as they sorted horehound and elderberry. Idris also brought dire news. The Saxon warband, now 50 strong, was moving through the forest, their axes sharpened for a winter strike. "They think you're weak," he said, accepting a woven cloak in trade. "Prove them wrong." The village prepared with desperate resolve. Cynric rallied the men to the palisade, their spears and bows ready. Bran led the archers, his yew-bow taut, while Elwyn and Morwen armed the women with slings and fire arrows. Leo, now trusted with a short spear, carried water to the fighters, his sling at his belt. Gwyn and the children sheltered in the deepest roundhouse, their voices singing Iarwen's songs to drown out fear. Branwen tended the sick, her herbs a lifeline against the fever that gripped Dafydd and others. The Saxons struck at dusk, their war cries cutting through the snow. 50 strong, they charged the palisade, their axes splintering wood. The Britons fought with the ferocity of those defending home. Morwen's fire arrows lit the twilight, one catching a Saxon's cloak, while Elwyn's sling felled another, her stone striking his helm. Bran and Cynric held the gate, their spears a wall, while Leo's stone stunned a warrior, saving Caddock's life. The pit traps claimed 6, their screams echoing. The village's unity was their strength, and the Saxons, bloodied and broken, retreated, leaving 12 dead in the snow. The victory was costly. 3 men fell, and Dafydd's fever worsened. The palisade was shattered in places, and the stores were strained by the effort to feed the wounded. Branwen's herbs saved. And storage pits. Textiles, reconstructed from fragments and texts like Gildus Dexidio, included woolen cloaks dyed with woad and madder, lined with furs for winter's bite. Herbal remedies like horehound and elderberry reflect Celtic ethnobotanical knowledge, while trade with Idris and Branwen's arrival mirror the exchange of goods and mobility of skilled individuals, as seen in artifacts from Tintagel. The Saxon threat is grounded in historical accounts, such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History, which describe Anglo-Saxon expansion and Briton resistance through fortified villages and desperate battles. The communal ethos, evident in shared meals and labor, is inferred from village layouts and collective burials, while children's roles in scouting and weaving reflect the practical education of the time. Morwen's contributions draw on the mobility of Dark Age populations, as survivors brought skills to new communities. The wolf threat reflects the environmental pressures of the period, with hungry predators driven closer to settlements, as hinted in archaeological finds of animal bones. The blend of pagan and Christian practices mirrors the period's religious transition, seen in cross-inscribed stones and ritual springs. Many, but Dafydd slipped away, his grave joining Owain's on the hill. That night, The village gathered in the hall, their faces weary but unbroken. Iarwen sang of the fallen, her voice weaving their names into the stars. Elwyn, her hands stained with herbs and blood, held Bran, Leo, and Gwyn close. "We're still here," she said, her voice a vow. Bran nodded, his eyes on the fire. "And we'll stay." Historical and cultural grounding. This continuation is rooted in the realities of Dark Age Britain, c. 5th to 6th centuries c. The late Antique Little Ice Age, evidenced by Treering data and pollen records, brought harsh winters with deep snow and early frosts, as depicted in the story's frozen landscape and strange stores. Settlements like Caer Gwent, inspired by hill forts like Dinah's Powys or South Cadbury, were fortified with palisades and roundhouses, their wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs built for endurance, as seen in excavations at Tintagel and West Stow. Food practices, rationing grain, smoking fish, and foraging nettles, align with finds of fish bones, wild plant remains. The winter of Caer Gwent tightened its grip, the cold a living force that seeped into every crack and crevice. By mid-January, the hills were buried under a thick blanket of snow, the river a frozen path broken only by the villagers' daily struggle to chip ice for water. The granary pits, though carefully rationed, dwindled with each passing week, their barley and oats stretched thin by the needs of the wounded and weary. Elwyn stood by the hearth in their roundhouse, her hands chapped from cold as she stirred a pot of nettle and barley pottage, its thin steam a faint comfort. Bran, beside her, mended a torn cloak, his fingers stiff but steady. The Saxon warband had been driven back, but their fire still burned in the eastern forest, and the village bore the weight of loss. 3 men dead, Daffod among them, and the palisade battered. "We've held," Elwyn said, her voice quiet but fierce. Bran nodded, his eyes on the fire. "But the winter tests us yet." Outside, Leo and Gwyn worked with the other children, hauling peat and firewood to the communal hall under Cynric's stern gaze. The children were the village's flame, their faces pale from hunger, but alight with determination. Leo, at 10, carried his bone-handled knife and sling with a warrior's resolve, his eyes scanning the snow for signs of wolves or Saxons. Gwyn, 6 and unyielding, wove rush mats to insulate the roundhouses, her small hands raw from the cold. Elwyn hummed a song of the old gods, its melody a shield against despair, but her heart ached for Owain and Daffod, whose graves on the hill stood as silent sentinels. The fever, though slowed by Branwen's herbs, lingered, and the stores teetered on the edge of exhaustion. The Britons of Caer Gwent were a people forged in hardship. The late Antique Little Ice Age had made winters merciless, with blizzards and deep freezes that locked the land, as evidenced by sparse pollen records and stunted tree rings. Their settlement, a cluster of roundhouses within a scarred palisade, stood as a beacon of defiance. The homes, with their wattle and daub walls packed with straw and clay, were sealed against the cold, their hearths burning peat and wood day and night. The palisade, battered by the Saxon siege, had been patched with stones and timbers, a task led by Bran and Caddoc in the fallen's memory. "For Owain and Daffod," Bran said, his voice rough as he hammered a stake into the frozen ground. Clothing was their bulwark against the cold. Elwyn, Morwen, and the women had woven heavy woolen cloaks, dyed with woad's deep blue and madder's rust red, lined with furs from deer, badger, and the wolf pelts from the recent hunt. Morwen's skill had crafted a new cloak for Caddoc, its edges stitched with a pattern of running deer, a gift that steadied his grief for Daffod. "It'll keep you warm on watch," she told him, her voice firm but kind. Her weaving, a legacy of her lost settlement, was a lifeline, and her presence was a second hearth for the village. Community was their strength. Sinric, the headman, gathered the village nightly in the communal hall, where they shared meals of thin pottage, smoked fish, and slow preserves. The hall's tapestries, woven with images of rivers and stags, glowed in the firelight, a reminder of their bond to the land. Arwen's stories of heroes like Ambrosius or the spirits in the sacred springs wove hope into the dark, while Father Dewey, the Christian monk, spoke of endurance and salvation, his patched robes a testament to his faith. "We are Caer Gwent," Cynric said, his gray eyes fierce. "No storm or Saxon will break us." The aftermath of the battle tested that resolve. The loss of 3 men, Caradoc, Dafydd, and young Ewan, had weakened the village's defenses, and the fever, though slowed by Branwen's herbs, claimed another elder. Elwyn and Branwen worked tirelessly, their hands stained with horehound and elderberry, but the herb stores were nearly gone. "We need a miracle," Elwyn told Morwen, her voice breaking as she applied a poultice to a fevered child. Morwen, her eyes shadowed by her own losses, nodded. "Idris may brave the snows again, but we must rely on ourselves." They foraged when the blizzards allowed, seeking frozen nettles or birch bark, but the forest was a frozen wasteland. The Saxon threat was a constant shadow. Caddock scouts, braving the snow. Transition, seen in cross-inscribed stones and ritual springs. Reported fresh tracks in the eastern forest, boot prints and broken branches, signs of a warband regrouping. The Northern Alliance, crippled by losses, sent no aid, and the promised grain was a distant dream. Cynric called a council, his face carved with resolve. "They'll strike when we're weakest," he said. The village fortified the palisade, dug deeper traps, and stockpiled stones for slings. Morwen and Elwyn crafted more fire arrows, their pitch-soaked tips a vow of defiance, while Bran trained the men and older boys, including Lo, to wield spears with deadly precision. A new challenge emerged: starvation. The flood in autumn had damaged the stores, and the winter's demands, feeding the wounded, stoking the fires, drained the granary pits faster than expected. Elwyn rationed the pottage carefully, adding boiled bark when grain ran low, its bitter taste masked with wild mint. The village hunted when the snow allowed, but game was scarce, and the wolves grew bolder, their howls a nightly terror. Bran led a desperate hunt, felling a lean deer whose meat was shared equally, its hide cured for a new cloak. Lo, ever brave, joined the hunt, his sling felling a hare that fed the children for a day. "For Caer Gwent," he said, laying it at Elwyn's feet, his eyes fierce. The children were the village's hope. Lo, now a trusted scout, ventured with Caddock to check snares, his sharp eyes spotting tracks in the snow. Gwyn gathered kindling and frozen herbs, her small hands stained with nettle juice. One evening, she brought Elwyn a handful of frozen sloes, her smile bright despite the cold. "For mead," she said, and Elwyn hugged her, her heart swelling. Cynric gifted Lo a leather arm guard, etched with a stag, for his bravery. "You're a warrior now," he said, and Lo stood taller, though his thoughts were with Dafydd's grave. The land was their guide and their trial. The Britons knew its secrets, where springs bubbled under ice, where mushrooms hid in frozen hollows, how to read a blizzard in the flight of ravens. They marked their paths with notched oaks and hidden cairns, a language only they spoke. Morwen shared tales of her old settlement's sacred hill, while Father Dewey preached of saints who walked the wilds. Elwyn, straddling both faiths, left a crust of bread at the river and traced a cross in the snow, her prayers a blend of earth and sky. The village needed every blessing, for the fever was spreading, and the Saxons were near. February brought a flicker of hope and a gathering storm. Idris, the trader, defied the blizzards to return, his cart heavy with salt, iron, and a rare gift, a bundle of dried herbs from the western hills. Elwyn and Branwen embraced him, their gratitude spilling over as they sorted valerian and comfrey. Idris also brought dire news. The Saxon warband, now 60 strong, was moving through the forest, their axes sharpened for a winter strike. "They think you're broken," he said, accepting a woven blanket in trade. "Show them you're not." The village prepared with desperate resolve. Cynric rallied the men to the palisade, their spears and bows ready. Bran led the archers, his yew-bow taut, while Elwyn and Morwen armed the women with slings and fire arrows. Leo, now trusted with a short spear, carried stones to the hill, his sling at his belt. Gwyn and the children sheltered in the deepest roundhouse, their voices singing Iarwen's songs to drown out fear. Branwen tended the sick, her herbs a lifeline against the fever that gripped the village. The Saxons struck at dawn, their war cries shattering the snow-laden silence. 60 strong, they charged the palisade, their axes biting deep. The Britons fought with the ferocity of those defending home. Morwen's fire arrows lit the morning, one catching a Saxon's shield, while Elwyn's sling felled another, her stones striking his helm. Bran and Cynric held the gate, their spears a wall, while Leo's stones stunned a warrior, saving Cadoc's life. The pit traps claimed 8, their screams echoing. The village's unity was their strength, and the Saxons, bloodied and broken, retreated, leaving 15 dead in the snow. The victory was Pyrrhic, for men fell, and the palisade was nearly breached. The fever claimed another elder, and the stores were critically low. Branwen's herbs saved many, but the village buried their dead on the hill, their graves marked with stones. That night, they gathered in the hall, their faces gaunt but unbroken. Iarwen sang of the fallen, her voice weaving their names into the stars. Elwyn, her hands stained with herbs and blood, held Bran, Leo, and Gwyn close. "We're still here," she said, her voice a vow. Bran nodded, his eyes on the fire. "And we'll stay." Historical and cultural grounding. This continuation is rooted in the realities of Dark Age Britain, c. 5th to 6th centuries CE. The late Antique Little Ice Age, evidenced by tree-ring data and pollen records, brought harsh winters with deep snow and early frosts, as depicted in the story's frozen landscape and strange stores. Settlements like Caer Gwent, inspired by hill forts like Dinah's Powys or South Cadbury, were fortified with palisades and roundhouses, their wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs built for endurance, as seen in excavations at Tintagel and West Stow. Food practices, rationing grain, smoking fish, and foraging nettles, align with finds of fish bones, wild plant remains, and storage pits. Textiles, reconstructed from fragments and texts like Gildas Dixidio, included woolen cloaks dyed with woad and madder, lined with furs for winter's bite. Herbal remedies like valerian and comfrey reflect Celtic ethnobotanical knowledge, while trade with Idris and Branwen's healing mirror the exchange of goods and mobility of skilled individuals, as seen in artifacts from Tintagel. The Saxon thread is grounded in historical accounts, such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History, which describe Anglo-Saxon expansion and Britain resistance through fortified villages and desperate battles. The communal ethos, evident in shared meals and labor, is inferred from village layouts and collective burials, while children's roles in scouting and weaving reflect the practical education of the time. Morwen's contributions draw on the mobility of Dark Age populations, as survivors brought skills to new communities. The wolf threat reflects the environmental pressures of the period, with hungry predators driven closer to settlements, as hinted in archaeological finds of animal bones. The blend of pagan and Christian practices mirrors the period's religious